Well, today I'm pleased to welcome back to the studio Caterina Bulgarella, and we're going to continue our discussion of your SAI Global paper that you authored, Predicting Risk, a Strategic Culture Framework for the C-Suite. So welcome back.
Thank you, Richard. It's great to be back.
It's a pleasure. So let's talk about two concepts that run through this paper, ethical ownership and ethical capacity. I hear those used a lot, and we're probably too afraid to ask what they mean. So here I go. What are those, and what should they mean to us?
Well, all right. Let me start with ethical capacity,
Okay.
because ethical ownership, just is under the umbrella of ethical capacity. So it makes sense to focus on ethical capacity. And the strategic culture framework highlights two key dimensions of culture. We talked at length about one of them, delegation of ethical dilemmas.
Sure.
And now you bring up ethical capacity, which is the other dimension. And ethical capacity, in a few words, is referring to the assets, resources, norms, expectations, beliefs. So we're talking about the culture.
So this is an organizational description.
It is.
Okay.
And all those facets of the cultural organization, they shape how people and the organization in its totality respond to ethical challenges.
Okay.
So, for example, just to make it very simple, training, many organizations expect their employees to go through ethics and compliance training. Training is an important asset because it's an important resource because it helps to create a certain amount of ethical awareness, knowledge, understanding of policies, and so forth. But it's one of the many things we need to look at, right? When we think about ethical capacity, which, by the way, as we are using the term capacity, I want to point out, ethical capacity works like a muscle.
So the more the better, I guess.
And the more you practice it, yes,
Sure.
Especially when you think about, voice or reasoning, right? You really need to engage, it's the type of, investment that requires constant work. Let's put it that way. Ownership, ethical ownership, is a key component of ethical capacity.
Okay.
And one way I put it, I ask the question, who owns the ethics of the organization? And I know that we've talked about this.
Right, whose voice is it coming out of?
Yeah, and so is it just the ethics and compliance team? Because we want as many stakeholders in the organization to own ethics. We want to really reduce the gap between ethics and business practices, right? So starting with the C-suite, senior leaders, the board, middle managers, employees on the factory, for everybody, should really have a mandate, a sense of accountability and a sense of responsibility toward the organization's ethics, which is, by the way, something that, from the standpoint of organizational design, is created by designing roles in a certain way, thinking about goals in a certain way, talking about ethics in a certain way. But ownership is really a key piece. Without that ownership, people are, have the space to start distancing themselves from ethics. So, all those mental operations where we displace responsibility or diffuse responsibility or minimize the consequences of our actions. I think that becomes a real possibility when ownership is not there. How do you see ownership? When you think about being at the front line, what is what is the shape and form of ethical ownership in a role like that one?
Well, I think it has to be owned at the worst of times.
Okay.
Okay. it's not unnatural that a company goes through market fluctuations. They may have a shortfall or a deficit in achieving their commercial objectives. I've been at those meetings, and they're not a lot of fun, right? Because that's the very loud voice of business saying, we need a get well plan. We need to make up a deficit. Those are the conversations where I think ownership is key. And I don't think it's that complex, Caterina. And as I share with organizations, all it is a little preamble or a preface to say, look, we're about to have a tough business conversation. I may get ready to bang my fist on the table. But before I do, I want to be clear. This conversation about how to succeed is not a conversation about how to cheat, take shortcuts, or take matters into your own hands. So I just want to be clear so that no one misinterprets what we're trying to do here. Those little, they're almost micro conversations,
I agree 100%.
right, have a huge impact, okay, on the commercial workforce, where they will then sort of feel more inspired to say, well, I'm not sure I can get there, or I need more support and resources. It's like when compliance leaders come to me and say, what do I tell my commercial teams when they say, you don't know what I'm up against, right? That's the point where you say, you're right, I don't know what you're up against. And I'll never know what you're up against unless you tell me.
Exactly. Help me understand.
Right? Yeah, because no one understands your risk better than you do. Right? And that conversation, in terms of ownership, it can be with a compliance leader, it can be with a manager, or better yet, everybody having that discussion together. So I guess that gets into my next question, which was ethical voice, right? Which, no pun intended, that sounds very nice. How does ethical voice get measured, and whose voice?
Well, it's when we talk about ethical voice, it's a two-way business.
Okay.
Let's put it that way. So just I think it's very intuitive, as we're saying, ethical voice. It's employees stepping forward and being able to share their experiences or their insights, their concerns with respect to certain challenges, but it's also business leaders being able to demonstrate vulnerability and bring up difficult issues, just to speak to a challenge and the true nature of that challenge, and so just be able to have that authenticity. Those are two key aspects of ethical voice. Another component that is also very important has to do with the level of confidence, the belief that any stakeholder in the organization can in fact just take action to correct a certain course of events, or to address, let's put it that way, to address a certain course of events, or has a certain amount of control on the ethicality of what they are doing, right?
Across functions.
Across functions, irrespective of where they are. I think that is critical, right? Because again, let's assume I'm on a team, and again, I see a manager discriminating against employees. Do I believe that I can address that issue? It's an issue that is highly inconsistent with the organization's values, my personal values. Can I do something about it? And probably there are certain channels and resources I can access. So the first question is, what's the instrumentality, the relevance of those channels, the confidentiality, etc. But even after I report that issue, will the organization address it in an effective way? And just from a practice standpoint, I think we always, organizations need to keep in mind the social costs that, generally speaking, people may experience as they evaluate or as they decide to step forward and share certain experiences, right? Because there is in many cases, in many cultures, there is a sort of a lot of values placed on silence and the status quo, right? And so it's, just to stick one's neck out is very difficult, and so the impression that just my voice might be futile, I think that is really a disincentive right there that needs to be fixed.
But as we've talked about, sometimes the toughest people to speak up about are ourselves.
Yes.
Right, and that gets back to trying to deconflict tensions where they exist.
And by the way, and you bring up an excellent point, because I think that highlights the importance of having broad conversations about certain issues, right? Rather than trying, to address those issues between me and myself, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it was a debate about, I always say, my debates were pressures that I kept to myself.
Exactly, exactly. And having that, just the opportunity to be challenged in a benign way with respect to certain beliefs or with respect to certain experiences or fears can be incredibly valuable in terms of, just addressing those issues and, just finding oneself in the right place.
Well, we've talked about so many different themes, but the one that we keep coming back to is business leadership, showing some vulnerability, and saying we can all embrace uncertainty and talk about conflicts because they're going to happen.
Yes.
Right? It's inevitable.
Absolutely.
So let's just have a better sense of awareness and sensitivity to each other.
Yes.
That there's nothing wrong with speaking up when we're uncertain.
Absolutely. And the belief that, that just conversation is critical.
Right.
And it's a conversation that I think is truly needed today, because there is a tendency to believe that if we start, just framing things that way, it means that we are not willing to win. We are not willing to...
We're weak.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are not going to get there.
Right.
And it's exactly the opposite.
It's intimidating.
It is, yes.
Especially for people working far away from HQ.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. But at the same time, it's really critical to open up, opportunities for learnings, and just to do away with certain biases, and to be able to see together, just ways to connect the dots, right? So how do we recast certain competing goals, priorities, within a more sustainable framework? I think we get there by having very tough, difficult, and humble, authentic conversations.
I think Mary Gentile says, if we can just talk about a problem, we're reducing its power to lead us in the wrong direction.
Exactly.
Just if we can name the argument.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, this leads to just one last point, which I'm very passionate about. I'm curious to hear more about what you have to say about it. As you talk about the relationship between employee well-being and organizational culture. Sometimes I call that duty of care. What does that mean to you?
Well, there is a, let me just be scientific for a moment.
Okay.
Just let me point out that, just the relationship between cultural well-being is an important relationship. Okay. And it's been looked at in different ways. We are talking about ethics and risk. So I think it's important to think about relationship through the lens of some of the things we discussed, right? So when we say competing demands, competing priorities, the pressure that goes with that pressure can become truly unbearable in some respects. And if you go back to some, a number of different corporate scandals and start, reading accounts of those stories of ethical failure, one of the, I think, most striking things is how employees, just involved in those dynamics, how they speak to the experience of, and just really feeling a tremendous amount of stress and distress, right, and anxiety, and so forth. There is a great deal of, there is research showing that if we feel forced to act in a way that is inconsistent with our ideal self, that is going to create
that's going to be stress.
Yes, stress, lower self-esteem, even self-punishment as a way to compensate what we are doing. So there are a number of issues that have to do with physical well-being, emotional well-being, which are absolutely, just central. One thing to keep in mind is that every single time an employee, a person joins an organization, they join with a personal code of conduct.
Of course.
Right? The ideal self, right? Those personal values. And I think that by and large, people want to stay true to their values. So, to find yourself in a culture where, just those values
you live them out.
Exactly.
Right.
Those values are being challenged. I think that becomes a powerful source of dissonance and discomfort, anxiety, and it creates all kinds of negative consequences. By the way, this type of experience is very different from the experience that people who choose to cheat may have when it comes to experience a so-called cheater high, right? That just intense positive affect, which is but even in that case, I don't know. I mean, there needs research to be conducted, but I think there are hidden costs that we are still not that are meaningful, and we may not be fully clear about. But there is something, some give and take in terms of, who we are, our values, and so forth, and those types of experiences.
It does. So we're almost out of time, but a quick question: what can a company do? What can a company do to show that they do care about employee well-being? That's a broad question, but are there any sort of snippets that come to mind?
I think they need to do the work that we were discussing before.
Right.
Interestingly enough, companies that have very mature practices when it comes to well-being, in terms of yoga classes and all kinds of programs, may still experience high levels of poor well-being. Let's put it that way, because the root cause of the problem may have not been addressed. Right. So it's not about just taking care of the symptoms.
Day.
Right. It's addressing the root cause of. Right, so it's really addressing that sort of unduly pressure, those conflicting demands.
The inherent issues we've been talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, this has been fascinating, enjoyable. I so appreciate you joining us today. So, Caterina, for those who might like to get a copy of the SAI Global white paper that you authored, or to get in touch with you, what's the best way to make contact?
I would say I would encourage them to visit the SAI Global website. Yes, and if they want to reach out to me personally, it's caterina.bulgarella@saiglobal.com.
Terrific.
Okay.
Well, thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Richard. It was great to be with you.
It's a pleasure.